So what does it mean to be here on your birthday in Johannesburg, South Africa, speaking to future leaders of this great continent?
It says that my work is not finished, and I'm very fortunate to be alive and in the presence of Humphrey Fellows who are giving me hope for the future of this generation worldwide.
You've spoken a lot about humility and leadership and this challenge of trying to figure out how you get power, how you get attention, how you get noticed, and then it's because you have something important that needs to be done or needs to be said. But in the process, too many times we've seen examples of history where power goes to people's heads or their hearts or their minds or something. And so you've given us some examples, and may I suggest you're a great example of that as well, of this balance between, this confident humility. How did you gain that? And why do you think that's important in today's world for leaders to model?
I was a very young diplomat when I worked at the UN in 1971, and I'd watched those who were representatives from around the world carry themselves with such poise and pride, but they never had to raise their voice to be heard. And I can't help but think of Kofi Annan, who was a quiet giant. Never once did you see or feel he was pontificating when he spoke at the United Nations or in any other international setting. And I soaked up those I wanted to mimic because I saw how they were able to command an audience, move an institution as complex as the UN forward without being demanding and making people frightened to even make a mistake in their attempt to satisfy a requirement that had been given to them. I also had a number of bosses who were not the best examples, and I promised myself that if I ever reached the level where I was supervising others, I would never go back and remind them, did you do this, did you do that? Because that used to irk me. And it's a normal reaction that you forget once you are at the top of the pecking order. And I also wanted to remember that it took a lot of sacrifices for me to get where I was. Many people had helped me, and I didn't want to forget them. So it required some serious introspection. And I may not have succeeded early on, but I saw where I made mistakes and realized that I had better ratchet back my sense of self and learn from cultures with histories much older than mine.
You spoke at the end of the session this morning about soldiering on. So what do you mean by that?
We can often say life is not fair and the political situation in country X, Y, or Z is not positive and it's not conducive to the image we would like any country, particularly the United States, to have abroad. But I will say that my colleagues who are career diplomats are steadily at the helm doing their work to encourage our genuine relationships with our counterparts in embassies around the world, because they've made it their life's work. Be knowledgeable of the culture, the history, and the desires of the country where they have been assigned. You can't mimic that. That comes from dedication. And so when I think and talk about soldiering on, I mean precisely that. To continue to work in the trenches, to do positive things for America.
So let's try. So just somebody in Gilbert, Arizona, Scottsdale, Arizona, and he probably had a neighbor next to his condo or whatever. And if he would have talked about the Hubert Humphrey program, they'd say, what the heck is that? And why should my tax dollars be spent on that? So what would you tell people?
I would say to him that, first of all, he needed to begin at the very early stages of the importance of exchanging ideas across cultures. And you can't do that sitting in your living room. No matter how much access you have to new technology, nothing really takes the place of a face-to-face encounter. And that's Edward R. Murrow's mantra. And I would also say, consider what it would be like to have an exchange person student in their home, or someone in their office, in their work setting, who has the expertise from a developing country that is very different from the one that we use each and every day in terms of our office settings. That expertise is a respect for elders, a respect for the knowledge of those who have been in a field longer than you, and the need to be willing to listen to them before providing what you think is the answer to a problem. But given the fact that these young men and women who have been in the Humphrey program see how communities are organized throughout the United States and how there is still that community involvement, I think that for countries on the continent, which are usually traditional cultures, they have a breath of fresh air about how they can approach changing the status quo. But I see in the Young Leadership Program, the Young African Leadership Initiative, and certainly in the Humphrey Program, a wellspring of knowledge and a wellspring of humility that would allow them to be successful in their endeavors.
So there's a lot of hope for that. You said something this morning, you listen to young people and we see hope, young people caring about their fellow men and women.
That gives me hope because they see opportunities where I wouldn't have even looked for or thought there might have been a chance. Through the arts, through serious research, but the interaction with others without being judgmental is so important. And they are far more open about the world in which we live. That gives me hope.
Last question. If, through the miracle of whatever, you had a chance to speak to the former Vice President, what would you say to him? What would you say to Hubert Humphrey?
A heartfelt thank you for leaving a legacy that tells me that civil rights will not go down in history as something that happened in the past, but the need to have equality for men, women of every race, color, and creed lives on thanks to your commitment to a changed and more positive view of the family of man.